Organizations that foster trusting, cooperative relationships are more likely to have a more satisfied, engaged, and more productive and innovative workforce. My name is Esther Martinez. I'm the CEO in People Matters, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation about empathy and how empathy connects with innovation and productivity. One thing is clear, the more I speak to many leaders like yourself, with CEOs, CHROs in the region, there is no going back to the work model that prevailed before the pandemic. And while we will continue to invest in technology and will increasingly play a role of providing the rails for a mobile and flexible hybrid workplace, I think, and all of us would agree, that the differentiator for an adaptable organization is going to be the ability to redesign a culture of empathy, trust, and compassion. But how do we engage our workforce? How do we retain our workforce? What are the different ways that we can really connect and feel connected with our workforce? In my view, these are maybe not the right questions, because to me, the questions are more about how do we embed a culture of empathy so that our employees want to stay with us? How do we bring in a more human leadership style so that our employees feel trusted and they are able to deliver to the promise to our customers? Empathy also impacts bottom line. According to a recent study by Business Solver, reveals that 87% of CEOs believe that empathy is linked directly to financial performance. So how do we shift this focus on leadership, culture, and enablement so we are able to enable our leaders, our teams to serve our customers and compete in this very volatile marketplace? To discuss these questions, I'm excited to be joined today with our anchor of the People Matters BeNext program on building culture of empathy for productivity and innovation, Michael Jenkins. Hi, Michael. Very good afternoon.
Hello, Esther. Yes, good morning to you. Yes, it's lovely to be here, Esther.
Thank you so much, Michael. So Michael is a regular speaker, writer, moderator on humanizing the workplace. He's new thinking on leadership development, the future of work, and sustainability is impacting organizations across the region. And Michael is the CEO and founder of Expert Humans, and he's also the author of Expert Humans, Critical Leadership Skills for that Disrupted World. And I love to invite you, Michael, to show us your book. And I'm so proud of an amazing work that you've done.
Here you go, Esther.
There you are. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thanks, Esther. Thank you.
And a lot of your research and a lot of your insights have actually been embedded in the course that we've put together for leaders to join us. So tell us a little bit about the course first, and I'm going to then invite you to take some questions related to importance of empathy to business. But tell us about the story of really bringing those human skills in the book and really reimagine and translating that into a course.
Well, thanks, Esther. I think the first thing to say is that our focus in the course has been very much a practical orientation. And we've really thought about how do we bring empathy into the organization. And for want of a better word, it's really about how do we operationalize empathy. So for instance, I'm sure, Esther, you're the same. I'm having lots of conversations with senior people, also frontline managers, and they say, I'm very interested in this idea of being more empathetic, having a more human workplace. But how do I do this? You know, what are the first things I need to do? So what we'll be doing is a really deep dive into how can we take empathy and make it a core part of the DNA of organizations. So that's our starting point, if you like, the philosophy for the program.
Awesome. And I'm going to be asking you more questions about how the 5-week program is going to help us operationalize that empathy and really have an outcome, which is a plan that you can implement in your organization. But before I do that, Michael, I'd love to understand, why is this so important? And why do you think organizations should really, really focus on operationalizing these new ways of leadership? And maybe what's the cost if they don't?
Sure. Well, Esther, I think the genesis of this started many, many years ago, perhaps even decades ago, where I think, like your good self and other colleagues, we work very closely with extremely talented people. So people who are technically extremely gifted, they know exactly what they need to do in their job, be it a lawyer, engineer, the whole range of people who have these wonderful technical skills. But the thing that's been troubling, I think, both organizations in general and to a degree the individuals concerned is, how do I actually dial up my ability to match my technical skills with literally my skills as a human being? And the way we see it is that empathy is one of those core skills. We're absolutely convinced that it's a teachable item, and that it's like a muscle, really. Once you get the opportunity to know how to practice empathy, you're going to be well on the road then to bringing empathy into your organization. So empathy is one of a number of things that I think we need to do. Further to your point, I think the other thing to say is that empathy, and probably its associated area or top area, which is compassion, these two words have really come into the business lexicon in a way that I have never seen before. So for instance, when I was trying to talk with CEOs and CHROs probably about 8 years ago about subjects like empathy and compassion, the feeling then was, this doesn't necessarily have a place in the business world. I can't really see how this connects. We have a sea change now. And the big challenge right now is not so much having to convince people of the necessity for more empathetic and compassionate leadership, but really helping them to be able to get to the heart of what that means. And that's what we're going to be doing over the 5 weeks of the program in many different ways, shapes and forms. I can go into that in a bit more detail as we go, Esther.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. So before we do that, I love the fact that you mentioned that empathy is a core skill, and it is teachable and it can be practiced. And I think that's just so empowering and so constructive to know that there is a roadmap for different people. May have different like muscles, right? You'll have different starting points and different abilities, but at the end of the day, it can be practiced and it can be teachable. I want to invite you to reflect about, I think a lot of us get worried about the consequences of not having a human leadership, and whether it's retention or attrition, and we really focus a lot about how do we retain people, how do we engage people, and are we asking the right questions, or do you think it's more about how do we enable our managers to create an environment that people want to stay with us? So I sometimes feel that as HR practitioners, we may be asking the wrong questions. So if we ask the wrong questions, then you lead into the wrong answers. So I love your opinion on that before we move into the practical elements of building empathy.
I think it's a great point, Esther. I think that what we need to be doing is asking the right questions. And I think the right questions are more around how can we build a foundational starting point for empathy. So for example, people will say, one of the things I'm worried about as a leader is that if I'm going to be very empathetic, is it going to in some way compromise my ability to hold people accountable to achieve the bottom line? Because in all of this, Esther, at the end of the day, competence is incredibly important too. You can be the most empathetic, most compassionate leader that ever walked this earth, but if you're not able to deliver the results as well, then that's not going to work either, because we have stakeholders that we have to satisfy, expectations that we need to meet. So I think a foundation of empathy, because empathy connects, you can imagine it like a mind map, for example. Empathy connects with things like trust, it connects with psychological safety, it goes all the way through to innovation, and as we've outlined in the program, all the way through to productivity as well. So it's building that foundation really onto which we can then almost like a superstructure, put these other very, very important items onto so that we can be successful.
Beautiful. So what I'm hearing you say is any of these elements, if you touch them, it will have a knock-on effect on other areas. And your research shows that empathy is one of those muscles that if you start working on those, then the engine of other things like safety, inclusion, innovation, and hence tapping into the collective power of everyone in the team and truly being able to be more productive is as a result of it.
Absolutely, Esther. And I think if I can give you an example, if you think back to the
Please do.
global financial crash of 2007-8, one of the sort of knee-jerk reactions of governments around the world was to say, okay, in order to make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen again, what we need are more rules, more regulations, in order to keep people in line. But of course, history has shown that human beings are extremely adept at being able to get around any kind of rule or new regulation that you might want to put in place. And really, we know with hindsight that they were actually addressing the wrong problem. The problem was the culture of these organizations that enabled them to think that it was okay to do the things that they did, because the culture was not in place. And this is why I think many of our listeners will identify with this. We see a resurgence right now as well in terms of interest in purpose and the notion of purpose-driven organizations, because no amount of rules and regulations are going to get you to where you want to be.
So true, Michael. And thanks for sharing that. And it resonates a lot with conversations I'm having with a lot of CEOs in the region that says, well, this is an opportunity for us to get closer to our purpose, because now we can change our business model, we can change the way we deliver to our customers. And we're not only reinventing our business model from financial perspective, but we're also using this opportunity to get closer to that vision and that purpose and get closer to our promise on the customer. So I think that's really the opportunity that many progressive leaders and organizations are looking. So I'm going to be taking questions from the audience, Michael, with your permission. And we have a list of awesome questions for you, but I want to make sure that we bring the audience as well. So if you have questions, we're going to take them as we go along. So please do feel free to use the chat, share your reflections, your questions, anything that you'd like Michael to give his opinion or insights. I will be taking it live. So, all right. So let me get to when you were mentioning about the program and how we help throughout the program 5-week journey from, the reflect to the assimilate areas and the tool sets we're going to provide, to then the apply and helping leaders to really work on a project for themselves on really operationalizing that empathy in their organization, to then, of course, in BeNext, we have the opportunity to give feed forward to each other. Give us a little bit of sneak peek on, how do we become more empathetic? What are some of the practical ways or activities that we will see in the program to develop those empathy skills?
Well, it's a great question, Esther. And I think the starting point in all of this, when we see as our end goal the bringing of more empathy into organizations, we also have to work on ourselves as well. So we see it as a kind of bicameral approach, if you like, working on yourself so that you can work on the organization as well. So there will be activities and exercises that invite people to think about what kind of practical things could I do to be able to improve my ability to be empathetic. And we'll be drawing on examples from around the world to give people, if you like, some insights and ideas into how they can tailor it for themselves in a way that works well for them. So to give you an example, there's a tremendous medical program which actually takes place in Southern California for young doctors. And can you believe this, Esther? They have a module within that which is around English literature. So we might say, what place does English literature have in a medical program? And the reason why they deliberately did this is that reading fiction, so reading novels, putting yourself in a world where you've never been, being able to see the world, to take a different perspective through the eyes of the writer, it sounds like a very simple thing to do, and it's obvious in some ways. It's sitting right there. The ability to develop perspective through reading fiction is, for example, one of the things that we will be suggesting that people might like to do. On another level, how often have you thought to yourself, the person that I'm interacting with seems to be very much using the word I all the time, rather than we, for instance. So a really tiny exercise that we will introduce to people is imagine you're going on a Zoom call, or perhaps in a post-pandemic situation, you're going into a room full of people. If you're like me, you might feel a bit hesitant about going in and networking with, working the room kind of thing. And we'll be asking people to think about, could you sustain 10 minutes of a conversation where you're not talking about yourself, that you're actually actively trying to find out about the other person? And that's where, for example, the use of questions, the skillful use of questions will come in. So we'll be looking at different styles of questioning as well, including something called motivational interviewing, which again, for those of you who have a psychology background, or perhaps you've been involved in counseling work as well, motivational interviewing might be something that you've come across before. It's a style of interviewing people, of interacting with people, that we feel can be successfully transposed into a very normal workplace environment. So some of the techniques, some of the skills that are involved in motivational interviewing, we can transpose those into the workplace with the aim of helping people to reach their own answers and their own conclusions. So I think sometimes as leaders, we're very, very quick to provide guidance. And there's a place for that, of course. But nothing is more powerful than helping somebody to arrive at their own roadmap, because then they are invested in it. You're not telling them to do things. They've actually worked it out for themselves. And this is all part and parcel of a more empathetic leadership style.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks, Michael. And a lot of questions are coming from the audience already. And I'm going to take the opportunity to pick up one of them that, I think as all of us are listening and hearing you, the question is that this is not just HR's responsibility. So shouldn't be not only HR, but the top executives, managers also taking part of a course like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's such a good point, because I think for those of us who live, work, and breathe the air of the HR community, so often things are kind of like dumped on our doorstep as though we're going to wave a magic wand and suddenly be able to create all of these things we want. Quite clearly, we need buy-in from everybody in the organization, and it does start from the top. So for instance, when we're exploring, so how do we actually bring empathy into an organization? We'll be thinking of ways in which CEOs particularly, but not exclusively, the way in which CEOs can create what we call empathy stories about their own organization, and then make a point of including empathy as a topic in, for example, the town hall meetings that they have. In other words, to bring it center stage, normalize it. And as we know, Esther, for people to remember things, stories are incredibly powerful. So no amount of statistics, throwing them at people will stick. It's the stories, those human stories, that I think are the most important. So what we need to do, and I think this is where HR could well play a fantastic role, is in working with the senior leaders to try to figure out, okay, so what exactly will our empathy story be, number one, and number two, how will we communicate that to people so that they feel, whoa, this is really authentic, this is something I can buy into and live by. So we'll be doing those kinds of things too. Again, just coming back to that point about how can we make this really practical and really implementable back in the workplace.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks, Michael. And there's one more question related to empathy, especially in the context of hybrid or remote. How is that more important than it was before, when we maybe had a physical area to create,
Yes.
underpinning engagement? And is how do you really look at promoting empathy in a context of hybrid?
Do you know, this is such a good question, and it's amazing, but I'm actually working on this area right now in terms of asking the question, okay, so we take the big rubric of empathy, but how does empathy show up in what we might call different job modalities? So the job modalities, by that I mean the way in which we work physically. So is it completely at home? You're always working from home. Is it that the organization has now decided that they want you to be in the office all the time? Is it a hybrid way of working, which seems to be the emergent theme at the moment? Or is it something else? And to ask the question, to get more nuanced about this, so that it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all, let's ask the question, what kind of empathy and what kind of empathetic approach might I, as a manager or leader, need to take when I'm dealing with team members who interact with the organization entirely at a distance, entirely online? They might be in a completely different geography. Is there a different type of approach, a more nuanced approach that we might need for those people as compared with the people that we perhaps have an opportunity to see face-to-face in the workplace? I think this is a very, very good question and a very rich area for exploration. And who knows, Esther, you know, we have a project element within the program. We call it the mindset. You know, what kind of mindset are you going to try to develop for yourself? And it could well be that there'll be members of the cohort group who will decide to take a deep dive into this particular area. And I, for one, will be very happy to support them in that particular journey, because I think it's an area that is ripe for exploration and research.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing that. And I think that's the beauty of the BeNext design methodology, that it's really a tool set and a guided, a practical way to discover. But at the end of the day, it is your project. It's in your hands, what you want to achieve out of the course and how you want to use the course, not just for learning, but really to accelerate problem solving in your own context. So I love your idea about maybe some of our learners will choose this as their project to say, how may I, you know, take the learnings from the course and put them in that context of whatever is my context, maybe fully hybrid, fully remote, whatever is that context. So that's a fantastic invitation for our leaders as well. So there is lots more questions. So let me take the next one on what are the drawbacks of not having empathy? At what level can no having empathy or not focusing on empathy can have in an organization?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think probably the important thing to say is that empathy is quite clearly, it's not, if you like, a silver bullet. It's something that is part of a raft of different things that need to be put in place. So one of the things we will explore in the program is the soft underbelly of empathy. And what I mean by that is that human beings find it much easier to empathize with people who are like them. By definition, you know, we can get into the mind space of someone who, for example, has a shared experience of the kind of education that we had, the communities that we live in. We're very familiar with those. I mean, in countries like Japan, for example, that there is a saying in Japanese, hara de dentatsu suru, which is to communicate with your stomach. In other words, the society is so in tune with itself that the question of empathy almost becomes second nature. So where the challenge comes for us, and this is something we'll be looking at as well, is how can we develop empathy for people who are really not like us at all? In other words, how can we circumvent some of the biases that can be inherent in empathy? Because that's a very important area to look at. So, for instance, you know, when we read the news, if a little child is trapped down a well somewhere in our community, we will be glued to the news. We'll be watching and listening to see what the rescue teams are doing to try to rescue that little child. Because we're very invested, because it could be our child. Whereas when we see a news item about, for example, a war-torn country somewhere halfway around the world where, you know, men, women, and children are dying, we can empathize to a certain degree, but maybe not to the profound level that we can when we have a closer connection already. So the challenge is, how do we build those connections? And we'll be looking at those in the program as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael. And there's a question that's very interesting, and we'd love to get your insights on that. How do we measure empathy? Is there any metric that we can measure. We can measure muscles. We can measure, you know, how many kilos you can lift with your shoulders, right? So how do we measure empathy?
I think there are probably a number of metrics that we could actually adopt if we wished. Of course, the challenge will always be, how do we disaggregate empathy as the key golden thread that actually produced the particular outcome? So for instance, we know through the research that organizations that have a lack of empathy in them are more generally going to be less human places to work. And people report that they don't really feel safe, or they don't really feel encouraged to be able to offer up their ideas for innovation, for example. We'll include one example of a software company where the team met. There was a glitch in the software. One of the younger members of the team immediately saw what the problem was and where it was coming from. But she felt, I don't really feel comfortable enough to actually say what I think. And so she kept quiet about it for about 6 months.
Oh,
and at the end of the day, people were saying, you know, this is really bad. We really need to fix this in some way, shape or form. And she said, well, I don't really know whether it will work. But I mean, one of the things that you could possibly do is this. And everyone was like, hallelujah, this is the answer to our problem. Why didn't you say before? You know, we've had 6 months worth of hemorrhaging potential sales revenues because we didn't realize that you actually had the answer. Why didn't you speak up? And of course, the person didn't speak up because they didn't feel comfortable to. So to try to create that environment in which people can speak up, in which innovation can happen, we can then look to some of the bottom line results in terms of revenue generation and see whether, through our active efforts to try to create a more human workplace where we're using empathy as a lever, can we, for example, measure before and after, or even over time? Because it is possible, particularly in some industries, to be able to get a very good fix on the measurement of empathy. I'll give you an example. In the US, there is a care home enterprise in the northeast of the United States. And what they did was they took 2 cohort groups. It's kind of an experiment. They took 2 cohort groups. One of the groups they put through what they call in the US virtuousness training. That is the sort of title that they give to these kinds of programs. So they put one cohort group through virtuousness training, and then the other cohort group they didn't give any support to at all, because they were interested to see whether by applying empathy in an active way, would it actually have an impact on fairly normal KPIs, right? So what was interesting was that as the exercise unfolded over the years, and this time span was 3 years, where they did benchmark, and 5 years. The first really exciting thing was that the cohort group that had gone through this virtuousness training, they enjoyed much higher KPIs in terms of what you might call, I'm going to call it customer satisfaction, but it's basically the experience of the people in the care homes who were being cared for by that cohort group. So the satisfaction ratings were much higher. And the really exciting thing was that over time, they realized, and this is the most amazing thing, they realized that the mortality rates of the people who were under the care of those carers who had gone through the virtuousness training or the empathy training were much better than for the people who were being cared for by those who had not gone through this training. And I'm not sure about you, but if you had, you know, a loved one who you're trying to select a care home because you literally cannot have them living with you. Maybe your place is too small. Maybe your life's such that your parents cannot come and live with you as they're getting into their golden years, and you want to be absolutely sure that you're going to be putting them in a safe place. And I know this sounds very commercial, I know that, but if you are able as an organization to say, hey, look, we have active empathy training for our carers, we can assure you to the degree that it's assurable that your loved ones will be in a safe and cared for environment. that is going to be a very important thing. And Esther, if I may, another couple of examples in terms of the measuring of empathy.
Go ahead, please.
One of the things we notice is that in terms of not just attracting people and retaining people, what we notice is that with the sort of digital transformation, it is pretty straightforward for people to evaluate your organization ahead of accepting a job offer from you. There's a multiplier whereby, Esther, if I offered you a job in my company, you could find out a lot about my company, how we work, how we behave, what our values are. And if we have created a story, an authentic story of humanity in our organizations, the word will get out. The word will spread that this is an organization where people are valued and where innovation thrives. And people will want to come and work for you, because we know the converse is true, right? Where you have a toxic environment where bosses don't listen to their people, the word gets out. That's the original question about measuring empathy. Is empathy the ingredient? Of course it isn't. But we see empathy as an enabler of all of these tremendous outcomes.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. And I love the examples, because it just, as you said, visually helps us understand how easy it is actually to measure, and how when we create a culture of empathy, so what our customers can be treated with empathy, and hence have that experience. So those are fantastic examples. So there was a comment, not a question, by one of our listeners that I want to bring to your attention, because he mentioned that we normally focus on the leadership and we build empathy at the leadership level. And the reflection was, it just takes way too much time to take it to all levels. So yes, we may have very empathetic leaders. Yes, we may invest in our leadership. But how do we make sure that, and again, back to the course, how do we operationalize that as a way of working, and not as the trait of our, just our leaders, but really operationalizing it at all levels, including that level where that software engineer would feel safe to say, I think this may work, and not wait for 6 months.
Right. Well, that is such a good question, isn't it? That clearly it's important that the people at the top kind of get it, and that they are invested and bought into the whole topic of empathy. Where I think we can do something really effective is to actively involve people who are junior in the system in the creation, for example, of internal programs that deal with topics like empathy and compassion. In other words, if I was a HR learning and development specialist, for example, I might be thinking of bringing in my senior leader to talk about the importance of empathy. But in the actual design of that program or that workshop, I would consult with some of the younger members of the group, because some of the evidence from the research suggests that Gen Z, for example, and younger members of the workforce are rather more able, this is not to say that others cannot, but rather more able to buy into the idea that empathy is a critical thing to do. So in order to get that, if you like, accelerated cascade effect, such that the notion of empathy doesn't sit just up here with the senior leadership, we need to bring it down and embed it in the actual fabric of the organization itself. And one of the great ways to do that would be to invite some of those younger members of the team to actively help with the design and maybe even the delivery of some of those programs as well internally.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So tell us a little bit about how we have layered the journey, especially towards the, the measurable outcomes, if I may, of the course. Anybody who will enroll for this 5-week transformational journey that we've designed for them, what do you think will be a measure of success for those leaders when they look back and say, well, what was the outcome? What do you, and of course we are only dreaming because we designed the program with the end in mind. So we will only know after we complete the first cohort. But what do you think will be the measurable outcomes?
Well, if I can answer that, Esther, by inviting everyone to imagine in their mind 3 beautiful blue balls, right, running from left to right. The first ball is around self-awareness, right? So who am I? How do I show up, first of all, in the organization? What do people think about me? What are my interactions like? Do I really know who I am? Is the first, if you like, ball that you can imagine. The middle ball is where we will look at self-compassion. In other words, the degree to which we take care of ourselves. Because, of course, I think it goes without saying that if we are not able to take care of ourselves, then we cannot take care of others. And that's where we get our third blue ball, which would be on the right side. And that's where we are actively being empathetic, if not compassionate, to others within an organizational context. So we've taken that as a little sort of, sometimes the simplest things are the best, I think, Esther, in terms of framework, in terms of looking at yourself and then gradually looking at how that will transpose itself into the organizational context. So for instance, we will, if you can imagine it almost as a sort of fishbone analysis diagram, where all of the interlocking parts, all of the pieces that come into that main line is of empathy. But we will have things like self-compassion. We will have an unpacking, for example, of what do we actually mean by compassion? Because compassion and empathy are so intimately intertwined. And so by doing that, we will invite people to set what you might call mini goals, mini targets within their own journey, to be able to say, okay, by the time we meet again, what are you going to do? You know, what kind of things are you going to challenge yourself to do? So that by the end of the program, those things that you've challenged yourself to do, you can have that sense of achievement that you know, you're shifting the proverbial needle. But I think the other really important thing for us to mention, Esther, is that it's not just the 5 weeks, really. What we want to do is we want to create what we call a tail, if you like, so that tail remains long after the program has ended, such that if you come on the program, you're going to become equipped with an ability to take your own team members also on a mini journey of discovery around empathy, if not compassion as well. So that would be the plan, I think, Esther.
Awesome. Awesome. I'm so excited, Michael, and I think I can see so many beautiful comments and all of you really enjoying this conversation with Michael today. And thank you very much for giving that energy to both of us. So I'm going to invite you for our final closing question. And we're going to have an opportunity to spend 5 full weeks with Michael when we start this program. And as you know, the program starts on 30th. I believe it starts on 30th of August. So in another 4 weeks. And we're going to have the opportunity to see and work with Michael in those 5 weeks. And you get an opportunity to learn from him a lot more. But if you were to leave us with maybe one thing to start, one thing to stop, as we embark into really changing that fabric, as you were mentioning, of the organization. And I know we spent 5 weeks for a reason. So it's difficult to say one thing to start, one thing to stop. But if you were to just leave us with a closing word of advice, what would that be?
Well, Esther, if I could indulge myself a little bit, I've got 2 things that I think we could stop.
All right, go ahead.
The first thing I think we could stop is an immediate desire to solutionize. In other words, to jump to an answer for everything. I would say press that pause button and listen. But don't just listen in a sort of superficial way. Be really present for the person that you're listening to. That would be one thing. The second thing, Esther, that I would say stop doing is let's stop putting things off. You know, let's stop saying, oh, well, maybe we'll deal with empathy, you know, another time, you know, when we've got a bit more time. The time is now, everybody. I think that we've got to seize the moment and take this opportunity to really explore empathy. So I would say, let's stop procrastinating would be my second stop.
Thank you so much. One more. All right, go ahead.
I can also sort of suggest a couple of things that you might like to start doing.
Sure. Sure.
Start asking yourself the question, are our organizational systems, processes, and policies truly reflective of the human organization we want to be? Because one of the very, very practical things we can do is to go through all of those and just ask ourselves the question, is this really serving our people? And if it's not, let's change it. So let's start thinking in those terms as well, Esther.
Super. Thank you so much, Michael. And I'm personally looking forward to the course and looking forward working with you on seeing how the tool sets and the approaches that you have designed for all of us are going to be impactful in these 3 blue, beautiful bubbles that you share with all of us today. So thank you once again, and I will welcome you 30th of August as we start the program on culture of empathy for productivity and innovation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
And for everyone else, inviting everyone to see the information. If you have any more questions, we'll be delighted to support you. Have a wonderful day ahead and stay safe.